the problem, right? In civil disobedience, politicians' incentives become, we need to end this. We need to get them off the streets, we need to get them out of the buildings, we need to restore public order and public confidence. And that leads to quick fix solutions. That leads to band-aids being slapped on problems to make the optics look good, to get people off the streets, but it doesn't achieve the concrete, deep and systematic changes. That comes from unglamorous work. That comes from unsung heroes who labour day and night on legislation, on lobbying, and on subtle changes. And I'll take them over a gung-ho hero standing in front of a tank any day. Proud to oppose.
Here. Right, I'd like to introduce the member of the government, second speaker for the proposition, Andrew Lopez, for a speech time to exceed 7 minutes. Here.
So I want to thank the opposition for bringing up a lot of problems, but no historical examples about civil disobedience. What I think was brilliant about Artem's speech is that he actually gave us examples based in history about how civil disobedience has been effective in changing the laws. They brought up a lot of problems, no solution. They talked very nebulously about how we can change the laws, we can vote. Not one example has been given thus far, which is why it is necessary that civil disobedience be an option that people in a democracy take to change unjust laws. We are very clear about how the motion proceeds, which is that civil disobedience, it is a practical step taken voluntarily by individuals who believe that the laws in their community are unjust and they are acting for a goal. These are not protests just standing in front of a tank to take a picture. These are protests because people are trying to enact change to better the lives of themselves and those in their community. We have individuals who are disenfranchised that the opposition does not talk about in any way. They say that people can vote. What about those who are undocumented? What options do they have? This is why it is necessary that we not only allow for legal protests, but we also understand that there are instances, even if they are small cases, when civil disobedience is justified. Yes?
So the undocumented are the people who presumably have the most to suffer from any backlash because the law doesn't protect them. Shouldn't they therefore be very cautious about advocating?
Well, I think that individuals should make their own choice. I do not think we should be paternalistic about what undocumented individuals decide to do or not to do with their time. If an undocumented person wants to engage in civil disobedience, I believe in that sense, as the resolution states, that is in fact justified. They stated that it can cause undue harm and that we need to engage and prove that it works. But Artem started his speech by giving multiple examples, never refuted by the opposition. Jim Crow laws, Rosa Parks, an individual that we still talk about today because her action of civil disobedience is one that we know was effective in enacting change. The Vietnam War, we have yet to see a draft ever since because those student protests were in fact so successful. Their argument is that sympathy will be lost, but the opposite is true. In fact, what we see is that when individuals engage in civil disobedience, it mobilizes those around them. Our argument is not that violence should occur. In fact, the definition of civil disobedience says it is a non-violent action. It is taken to enact change. So what we see is the opposite. People get together and they support members of their community because they care about each other. And that's what causes us to change laws. Their argument is that you need to convince the establishment that you're not a threat. If the establishment already thinks you're a threat and therefore supports unjust laws, how can you ever convince them to do so? Most people who engage in civil disobedience have tried legal protests first. And the reason that they engage in civil disobedience is because it has already failed. Changing the laws is not the final step. As they have stated, they said it, instead you need to have support and then change the laws. I'm not really sure what the point is here, but our argument is very simple, which is that civil disobedience needs to be a tool in the toolbox when all other options have been engaged and are no longer working. It is a way for us to be able to partake in a necessary, justified, and nonviolent action to affect actual change in our communities. People should be able to make their own choices to engage in this kind of action if it is what they think is necessary to have change.
No. You have a question? You want an example of like from our side? So like civil obedience, I mean, we can pick any example because that's pretty much everyday politics. If we are to look at like specific movements, like marriage equality in Ireland was achieved by a popular vote in a referendum. So that is an example that we didn't angrily establish when we got people on our side in a positive manner.
Yes. So our argument is not that we can't vote for things. Yes, in many different situations, legal protest works, things, engaging the government works, but there are situations where that doesn't work. And especially in the historical examples that we've given and the current examples that we've given, we think that civil disobedience needs to be an option. You need to prove that civil disobedience is never an option, and our burden is to prove that civil disobedience, in certain situations, ought to be an option, especially for disenfranchised persons, to engage laws that are bad. Yes?
So, if I gamble my life savings, I might win. It probably was still a really stupid thing to do. The fact that things work out sensibly sometimes doesn't mean you were right to do it. You have to look, and on balance, will it probably result in a good or bad result?
I don't think that example is exactly comparable. First is people should have the legal right to be able to engage the government, of course, in the context of a legal protest. But in addition, it is justified, which means that there is a good reason to engage in civil disobedience when you are challenging a law that you think is illegal or is immoral and violates the social interests of your community. So we believe that individuals should be able to engage in civil disobedience if it's what they think is necessary to affect change in their community. Your argument, again, is pure paternalism. Your argument is, we know better than you, so you should not go out and fight for your rights. And if that was the case, if we just only ever allowed people to vote, we would not have the society that we have today. We would never have had student protests. Rosa Parks would not be someone that we talk about today. We may still have Jim Crow laws. So we believe that it's necessary to engage in different kinds of disobedience when it is an extreme case. And in addition, we also think that there's massive corruption at the government level that does occur, and that's why it's necessary, not only in the United States, but in other countries, for people to engage in civil disobedience, like the example that Artem gave, which was the Russia example, because there are voting irregularities, so we can't only leave it up to voting to be able to change laws. Thank you.
The next speaker for the opposition, Amy Green, give a speech not to exceed 7 minutes. Period.
Okay, look, we clearly have different ideas of what our democracy is, because if we still lived in the era in which women weren't allowed to vote or whatever, I would absolutely be out there with the suffragettes just like, fuck you, shut up, right? This is the difference. We have legislative equality, and that's what changes it. That's what makes it a democracy. When you have the opportunity to engage in the political systems in ways that are democratic, that represent you fairly, that don't frame you as some angry individual, instead of part of a systemic movement that you're representing. When we are talking about democracy, we say that there are alternative avenues for you to take. So to reference like Jim Crow laws, the fact that we wouldn't have X, Y, or Z without like civil disobedience, that's working in a different system. We are talking about, is civil disobedience justified in a democracy where you have alternatives, where you have the opportunity to vote, where you have the opportunity to run for election positions, whatever it is. And under that system, we say that it is not justified to disobey civil law, because what that does not benefit your movement. It doesn't benefit you as an individual. It doesn't benefit you as a marginalised person, because instead what it does is frame you as angry, as not sympathetic, as causing harm. We don't think No, but the establishment are just inherently evil all of the time. We think that people are lazy. We think that people are apathetic. They just don't necessarily care what is happening. So yes, it is good to get them to pay attention. It's not so good to get them to pay attention in a way that inconveniences them and makes you look just irrational. Because unfortunately, sometimes as a marginalised community, as a minority group, you have to position yourself as reasonable and fair and make people listen to you, because that's how stuff works. Because otherwise, all of their narratives that are like causing you hassle in the first place, they get a reason to justify that. They get something to back that up. They get a foundation for their argument that you don't deserve stuff anyway because you're just so annoying about it they don't want to listen to you. There are so many alternatives here to civil disobedience. And what happens as well, it's also about like who gets to participate in this? Like, who is it that we are characterizing as like staging these protests or these like sit-ins or whatever it is? Because if you're talking about like a platform that this gets attention, not only is that attention going to be largely negative, but the people pushed to the front are always like the most on the axis of part and intersectionality here, and the people who are like more naturally going to get the attention anyway. So like a common critique within Black Lives Matter is that it's always the deaths of black men who get pushed to the front, despite the fact that say the highest rate of like murder across the states is black trans women. Why is that? Because it's more palatable to the media, it's easier to capitalise on, and even within that movement, it's easier for those voices to get heard. So when we're talking about the loudest and angriest voices coming to the front, that's not even helping the most marginalised, because the most marginalised are always pushed to the back and they're always framed as the most irrational, and it is so much better for them to be seen as legitimately representing their concerns in a fair and democratic manner, because ideally we are trying to get to a point where we are all equal and have the opportunities actually get out there.
So in a system where the definition of minority means that they will never be recognized, would you say that some recognition is better than no recognition at all?
Like, what's like not recognized here? Because I mean, several minority groups, the good thing and the problematic thing is we have legislative equality for a lot of groups right now. So like I would say that like we still have sexism, it's still a problem, but like in terms of not being recognized with the opportunity to enter into politics, like the LGBTQ plus community is also like by definition like a minority, they're ethnic minorities and so on, but the opportunities are there. Does there need to be improvements? Absolutely, but the thing is we can still have our voices heard in a variety of ways, whether that's voting or putting ourselves forward for positions. It's not saying there aren't disadvantages here, but that's the thing with democracy, that's where we're at right now. Legislative equality has its issues, and that once it's achieved, often we forget that there's still progress to be made, because we think it's all there in the policy, and then it becomes so frustrating because it's like, what do we tackle? And I think that's why we turn to civil disobedience often, because we have so many issues and nobody is listening because they think we are there now. So like after marriage equality in Ireland, a lot of people think that the LGBTQ community is fine. We've dealt with all that now, even though there's still a lot of homophobia and transphobia and stuff like that. So it is frustrating, and it does make you angry. And like women have had the votes for decades, but you still have the wage gap and like all the CEOs and like tend to be men, whatever it is. So it's really frustrating. But the thing is, we have the avenues. They're frustrating. We still have barriers, and often those barriers are invisible. But the way to tackle them is not by framing yourself as even more irrational and hysterical than ever before. And also like when we have stuff now, like social media, like platforms that we can utilise ourselves and discuss with ourselves and whatever else, why is it that we are turning to civil disobedience in order to get attention, when that attention is not going to draw properly to our cause? Because at what opportunity there is someone going to, listen to your entire speech or read your manifesto or go into the details? Instead, all they're going to get is the headline. That's what people are going to get from this. They're going to get a soundbite. And is that soundbite, why can't I speak, going to properly represent you? Is it going to represent your issues? Because this is the thing, once you get past legislative equality, the barriers do become slightly invisible, and they're harder to explain. It is much more difficult now to say like why I am disempowered as a woman or as a queer person or whatever it is, because it's not as obvious as it used to be. It's more complex. And if we're trying to focus on issues that are complex, why is it that we return to something that the headlines and the photos don't capture any of that? They don't get any of the background. We need to build discourse. We need to build upon ideas and get them shared with people. And how do we do that? We have the opportunity now, where like we are seeing a change where, because the power is shifting, because the legislative equality framework is in place for different groups in a way that it never was before, we are getting to run for positions, and we just need to focus on that. And also, what we heard from the other side, which I thought was really confusing, is that like we are deliberately disenfranchising like minority groups from voting and engaging in the system. right? Like, if that is the case, then surely the best response is to, like, directly tackle that by voting and getting in the system. Like, these people, the reason the establishment is, like, trying to get you to not vote is because that is how they maintain power, whatever it is. So the way to do that isn't to say, oh, I don't like this. It's to get out and vote and choose representatives. We are seeing a shift in that now, because then people have to listen to you. You're not just some irrational member of a crowd. You get people who are, like, listen to you as full people. You get to talk about their experiences, because if you have an individual politician who gets to, like, at the speech there, people don't, like, have to engage with what they're saying or the platform in which they're saying it, right? Like, if they're at a debate, if they're giving a speech at a political conference, whatever it is, they have to recognise the legitimacy of the arena in which they're speaking. People don't have to do that if you're at a sit-in. Instead, what they get to talk about is how inconvenient it was. They get to label you as irrational, and that does absolutely nothing for your movement. That's not justified. And it also doesn't focus on the issues we're at now. So we've heard from this side that, like, democracy somehow extends to places where you don't have legislative framework of equality for minorities, which just is not the case. And when you do have those opportunities that are legitimate, that are seen as fair, and that represent you better because you get a platform to fully hash out your issues and talk about the problems that are facing you right now, that is so much better for you. It furthers you, your cause, your movement, and also if you're going to engage in these things and be seen as civilly disobedient and, like, framed as a criminal or whatever, and you then decide that you want to actually be where the policy is, like, being created, you're already, like, you're made illegitimate by your passport. So no, stick with the system. It is frustrating, but it's seen as more legitimate, and you open up your opportunities in the future. So have to oppose.
So for the next 10 minutes, this is your time. This is the town hall portion of the debate. So we'd like for you to address your questions or offer your comments about the motion. If you're asking a question, I'll do my best to interpret it so the microphone will hear it. And please let us know which side, the proposition side or the opposition side, you're addressing your question to. Questions? Not everybody at once. Okay.
For the proposition. So, you repeatedly stated that you don't support any form of violent civil disobedience. Far too often you've seen situations like Baltimore, Ferguson, where they have gone increasingly violent. How do you support any form of disobedience if there is an element of risk that it could be violent? And in turn, you are hurting your own cause because you're causing damage to the city. Taxpayers are being, cities and businesses are being ruined.
I will not repeat the question. Please include it in the answer.
Okay, well, we think, first of all, that this violence that you talk about is in response, it is the backlash to the fact that there is no means by which this change can happen, right? And we think that, given the alternative of civil disobedience that is nonviolent, we would much prefer that to the violence that arises as a direct result of the fact that these people can't change the system.
And to add on to that as well, if we look at the definition given for justified, it means for a good reason. So when we're looking at the scope of this debate, it's hard for us to say what could happen after that as a result of, the civil disobedience that we proclaim and we support as being nonviolent. So when we're saying that the civil disobedience that people take upon themselves is for a good reason, which is because there is no other option, we do prefer that given the risk.
Any response? Sure.
So we're talking about justified. Like, anger is justified. Frustration is justified. But by your own definition, you're saying that when engaged in civil disobedience, it is with awareness of the consequences. We are saying that those consequences mean that it is not fully justified because we think that it won't achieve what it wants to achieve. Do we think that they have, like, reasons that would motivate them to do something? Absolutely. We just think that there are alternative avenues that are far more justified because they are preferable in the consequences they achieve.
But all the examples that you brought up are examples of people where people have the political process, have the political capital already existing within the system to do that, right? But that's simply not how democracies work. Like, not everyone in a democracy is able to vote. Not everyone is able to run for office. So your entire scheme falls apart.
Somebody else? Another question? Address for the opposition?
I'm happy to keep loving those guys as well.
That works too. All right.
So, I actually...
John, you want to fix? Or is it this?
Okay. So biggest example that you've given so far for your side of working within the system is marriage equality in Ireland. Was there no examples of civil disobedience that helped push that through?
No, genuinely wasn't a thing. I also would say on the examples front, this is important, it's actually part of the nature of what we're arguing, that examples are hard to find because it's not catchy and it's not flashy and it's often very behind the scenes and doesn't make a convenient photo that you can slap in a history book. That doesn't mean it's any less vital. No, you can't.
Of course you can.
Anyway. Okay, but when we look at this motion, first of all, we're not necessarily saying that civil disobedience is the only means by which you can achieve the results, right? We're saying that in some cases it is your only means, but not always. So, for example, when you look at the example of civil disobedience, right, like the Rosa Parks example, in that particular scenario, that was the only choice. That was the only choice by which you could get onto a stage, so to speak, to project your cause, right, to gain sympathy from the people, to actually enact change within the political process, because there was no other way. So,
and to further that, with the examples that were given by the opposition side, when they say that in their previous speech that there's still inequality, there's still sexism, there's still racism, this only furthers the point, because they say engage with the system, but when we see and we follow that model and we engage with the system, and the system says all men and women should have equal rights, people should be able to marry whom they choose, and we see that there's still inequality, that just proves that the legislative system or the judicial system or just this governmental system is not good enough in order to solve the problems at hand, and that is absolutely why civil disobedience is necessary to bring awareness to these inequalities that persist.
So, if I can respond to that, Dave?
Please.
So, firstly, I'd say that you can't have it both ways, right? So you can't say we have this great history of civil disobedience, Rosa Parks, love her, and say, guys, things haven't worked. It's a disaster. We still have sexism and racism. One of those two things must be false. We would suggest that civil disobedience worked to an extent because we would deny that the Jim Crow South was a democracy. We're not sure why you're still defending that. But it came at a cost of backlash and prevented from building a constituency, which is necessary for that further changes that Amy talked about to successfully deal with more insidious systemic discrimination.
Yeah, two things also. So, like, if you're saying that the government and establishment is ineffective at dealing with the issues at hand, then surely the solution is not to keep yelling at them, because they've done as much as they can, right? They've changed the legislative framework, like, as far as they possibly can. The policies are there. So, in order to change their attitudes and social stigma and whatever other kind of barriers, get the people in government. If the government's ineffective, constantly telling them that they are not doing enough isn't enough. They don't get your representatives in, have direct representatives in. Secondly, what was my quote on this? Oh yeah, okay, so examples and stuff. So we're hearing a lot about civil rights movement. What about the Brown case that allowed that schools be desegregated or whatever else? When we think of examples of civil obedience, so often they are smaller steps, but they can be big steps too that are taken in the system. So I studied law or whatever, and a lot of the landmark cases a lot of the landmark cases they're examples of civil obedience that work for minorities and getting them their voices heard, getting them into areas that they've been denied entry to. A lot of history in Ireland about progress of equality, whether it be marriage equality or getting divorce legalised or whatever, they were done through the courts. So there were various options. Yes, some people were left out of that, but one of the some of the cases were to allow people who couldn't access the courts access to the courts. There are ways to engage that frame you better and actually pave a pathway for entry in the future.
Well, I think that's why civil disobedience is so important, because it's a goal-oriented action. So civil disobedience occurs by people who are trying to enact change, which means that it's not an action that's taken without any sort of goal for after the protest. It's a protest that occurs for specific reasons by people who are trying to enact change. Your argument is that these individuals are a hassle, they're annoying, they're angry, and our argument is that they're not a hassle, and even if they are a hassle, that it's good, because that's what will bring awareness to the cause, and that if they are such a hassle, that's likely why there haven't been legislative changes to address their needs in the past, and that when they engage in this form of disobedience as a last resort because they're being disenfranchised by the system, that might be the step that's necessary to address the issues that we see.
Also, I think it's important to note, to add on to that, that the legislative process that you're talking about only exists because of the civil disobedience that has happened in the past, and I think that that's important.
Yeah, but I hope that wasn't a democracy.
Zach?
Yeah, sure. So for the opposition, achieving the status quo has been a result of historical successes of civil disobedience, so why is this tool no longer needed in the present?
Is that to us?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there's twofold. Part of it that I think we've hashed out an awful lot is that there are different situations. We're genuinely concerned that the problems of the present are more insidious, less legal and less formal and more subtle than in the past. And when that's the case, I think backlash is something you should care about a lot more, right? Because formally, people have equality. The problem is the kids are told that they're lesser than each other from a young age, and people aren't given an opportunity to engage the same. But if civil disobedience makes that worse at the expense of more formal equality that hasn't gotten us what we want anyway, then I don't think it's justified right now. But we've already said that, and it's not to rehash. The other thing that I genuinely think is the answer to it is that if I were to agree with you and say that civil disobedience is acceptable, then what wouldn't? We keep answering them, why not violence? And they say, well, because civil disobedience is the best alternative instead of it. But I mean, often civil disobedience in a couple of cities won't fix the world. So why then won't you do anything that's necessary to achieve the goals if you sincerely believe that we shouldn't patronize people or tell them what to do? Is my sneaky question and an answer.
What? I think it's really hard that we'll try to have it in the two extremes, right? You say, well, why wouldn't you just be completely violent, but also you shouldn't even be able to engage in civil disobedience. Our argument is that when we see civil disobedience, which is non-violent, which allows different groups to engage in a peaceful manner that may still be breaking the law but doesn't lead to loss of life, that we can have a middle ground that is still extremely effective, gets different disenfranchised groups to participate, does not isolate people, which is your argument in the way that violence does, but is still extremely effective. What we see with civil disobedience is that because it's non-violent, it means that people are more likely to take part in the protests and that they're less isolated from the movement, because a lot of people don't want to engage in violence and don't want to say, hey, we saw this violent movement and we want to be a part of it. In your world, you would never, for example, allow the Black Lives Matter movement to have their form of civil disobedience, which we think is a problem.
Also, to add on to that, you're still assuming that everybody has a representation in the current legislative system. That is not the case, for example, for refugees who do not have representation in the system, and native. So, you're still leaving a lot of people out of that system.
I'm going to stop the question and answer portion so that we can continue to the close. And to close for the opposition side, Adon Pila will have a 5-minute speech. Now, there will be no points of information during this speech. This is uninterrupted. You're here.
Thank you very much. I am in many ways a very simple man, and I'm easily swayed, which is unfortunate because an awful lot of what Proposition have tried to sell you tonight is so appealing. Civil disobedience is apparently the panacea. It is the solution when you have nothing else to do. It's the one violent, but not too violent, resistance that you can give to a state that keeps pushing you down. But here's the problem. I think you all know intuitively that civil disobedience is winning no hearts and minds, right? You are probably antagonistic to most of the community and likely to make them backlash. So then what you have to hope is that it makes them change. It's that you're that thorn in their toe that won't go away to the point that they'll give in to. And here's our problem with Proposition. For every inch that they try to tell you that civil disobedience isn't as bad as you think, we tell you that it isn't as effective as they think. If it doesn't really hurt anyone, if it is only a minor issue, but not really breaking the law, you know what I mean? It's just like downloading DVDs, not like doing hard drugs. It also isn't as fun as doing hard drugs, or is likely to create the kind of world that they want you to live in. So the first question I want to ask myself is whether this really is fair, and the second is whether it's likely to be effective. So at the beginning of this debate, they told you that they're all cogs in the system, part of oppressing you, and therefore they should deserve anything. Now, I don't think they believed that, because they wouldn't deserve anything violent to be done to them, or any kind of issue. My first concern then is why they fetishize violence in a way that they don't recognise any other kind of attack on a person. And people have rights to property, they have other legal rights that are happy to throw away, and the only answer that they've ever given us for this is that it's not that bad, it's not quite as violent. But again, it's not going to be quite as effective. But the other point that I think you should realise here, and throughout this debate, it's not the rich business owners who are going to be hit first when communities turn to rioting or when there are sit-ins that turn violent. It will be your community, people who are also suffering, individuals who, if they are part of a machine, they definitely never asked to be or never wanted to be. And there's a real question that you need to ask yourself before voting as you want to with this proposition, as to whether you should take your anger out on them when you know it's going to hurt them. The next question, quite obviously, is that they said violence, never acceptable. This will likely turn to violence, but sure, listen, who can tell the future? Let's just close our eyes and keep on going. It's not good enough, really. We have seen enough historical evidence. They know themselves that these movements turn violent, and if they had had any guts in this debate and actually stood over that violence, then we'd engage with them. But I think they already lost when they realised that that's the direction it's going to go. The last point that we want to point out in terms of fairness is whether this leads to a kind of a backlash. This brings me to my second argument of efficacy. But to begin this, I think we need to take a step back and ask, what am democracy? So they said, America, probably, because America. We said often, not so much in the past. The reality is, and this is genuinely an important part of this debate, if you live in such an oppressive regime that swathes of the population may not vote, then is it reasonable for them to stand up violently to the system and go beyond civil disobedience? Absolutely yes. But we don't. We do live in a system with formal equality, and that is the context that this opposition has debated the debate under. There are ways that you can change it. And don't buy their idea that they're all, wimpy and ineffective, but by God, if we had a peaceful march, that would just turn them all around. Like, what nonsense! They're giving you barely anything more than we can, except they want to break the rules and look more angry about it. And this brings us to our point of efficacy, when we think that really you're going to gain far less. Because they did have an argument, that even in your finest democracy, what about the undocumented people? What about the refugees? As the Irish, we have an answer to this. We would point out that those are often the most vulnerable in the community. Those are not the ones who start these protests, who organise the sit-in. Those are the people who will be excluded from public spaces. They are the ones who will have racist slurs thrown at them. They are the individuals that will suffer all of the backlash that this proposition doesn't have enough time to care about. And that backlash matters more than it ever did in the past, because in a democracy, look like a warning, in a democracy we have formal equality. What there is left to call about is the informal equality, the substantive rules that individuals deserve, because there is a world where we think there is insidious sexism more than ever before, where racism is institutionalised more than it has been in the past, and where bigotry is entrenched. But there's always a reason, right? Like those cops who shoot people on the streets do face hearings. There are just reasons that the hearings never find them guilty. There are subtle reasons that need to be taken down. That subtlety depends on opinions of people on the street. Opinions that this proposition colour against them when all they're willing to care about is do what is most violent. Finally, the argument we gave you in this regard is that the discussion gets fragmented, right? Because that's the point. They don't have a discussion anymore. They have a threat. They're trying to take the system down. And that means the loudest voice gets called on. Even amongst the minorities, there are people who are forgotten. And that's not good enough for us on proposition. Since we have a democracy, why not use it to its best effect? And why not campaign in the way that we should, rather than endorsing civil disobedience?
All right, thank you very much. And now, to conclude the debate, Julia Lynch. Here.
Thank you, everybody. We love debating the Irish here at Miami because they have all the jokes, but we have the evidence. When you're looking at historical examples and you can't pinpoint a single movement that has resulted in positive matters without looking at civil disobedience, and these movements that I'm talking about are ones in which people's rights are infringed upon. Where people don't have the same, where one person does not have the same access to resources and ability to make their own decision in a democratic society as the next person. So when we look to movements such as the civil rights movement, such as the LGBTQ LGBTQ movement that is ongoing, and gender equality. And we see that none of these movements would have been successful without civil disobedience. You ought to vote for the government side today. So in the framing of this debate, as my partner brought up at the beginning of the speech, the burden of the affirmative is to prove that not necessarily civil disobedience is the only answer, but that in some cases it is necessary. And what the opposition has failed to do is to provide even one example of where civil disobedience has led to the backlash that they are talking about. They are saying all of these theoretical ideas, but they do not actually provide an example of such civil disobedience leading to anything negative, to leading to violence, whereas we provide a plethora of examples of where civil disobedience has not only required legislative change, but also held our legislators to higher standards where that legislative change is not good enough. So now I'm just going to extend some of the arguments that show why the affirmative side is so necessary and why civil disobedience is absolutely justified in a democratic society. And the first one is being that unjust laws and the necessity of being able to have a forum outside of the legislative and judicial system in order to challenge such unjust laws. In a manner in which they are saying that everyone has a right to vote. Not only is that not true, but I will prove that even if that is true, it's not enough. First, my partner brings up the fact that not everybody has a right to vote. Not everybody has an equal stake in the outcomes of our government. When we see that not only do undocumented immigrants not have a right to vote, but also people that have committed felonies have paid their time and have no longer have the right to affect change. When we see that voter ID laws are being proposed to be put into place that only further restrict the voices of minorities as well as people who deserve equal rights as other people. When we see that no, though this perfect legislative system does not exist, we see that civil disobedience is only further necessary. But say you agree with them and think that, oh, the legislative system does exist and that it is fair for everybody. However, when we are looking at the scope of this debate and we are looking at the problems that are pressing the issues, which are problems that affect the minority, by definition, the minority is never going to be equally represented within government, which means that the legislative changes that they are calling for and that they say will happen will never occur. Because when you are the minority, how are you going to affect legislative change if you will never get the majority votes? It doesn't make sense. But what civil disobedience does is that it builds coalitions. It brings awareness to the issues that are absolutely necessary. And their response to this is backlash. And they say that backlash occurs. But the only people that are lashing back against this are the people that are so far gone that they would never support the cause in the first place. What we are targeting is the people in the middle. The people that are unaware of the injustices occurring in our society, but are made aware and joined in the coalitions to form movements that better solve and better make effective changes in society. Now next they say efficacy, and they say that basically that this brings about, you know, the most violent voices or the loudest voices and disenfranchises the actual true minority. But when we see that the alternative to civil disobedience is those people not having a voice at all, we prefer civil disobedience. And the government and this society as well as this room should vote for it as well. Civil disobedience is the only way to affect change outside of the legislative system, and in that manner, it does not bring about the negative repercussions as well as the inefficiencies of relying on sole governmental means does. When you look here today, you see evidence and you see jokes. What we ask you to vote for is not only evidence, but morality and efficacy. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much for your attention. I'd like if you would do us the favor of taking a piece of paper, if you have a piece of paper, there's paper up here, and write down your vote for the proposition team, the University of Miami, or the opposition team representing the Irish Times champions. And we'll collect those up in just We have your swag bags.
Just because we have the bags, we still want to win. I hope people are sharing on the basis of that.
Just take a picture.
I was thinking about that. Ooh. Oh, I think this is very stylish. Thank you for bringing this. I'll go for a B. I will. Thank you very much. No, it doesn't apply. Yeah.
I'll take these.
Yeah, this is going to get governmental, but that's different.
That would have blown up the scope of the argument. But they're showing, they're arguing that it's status quo. You don't want
Also, it's not civil disobedience, but it's governmental. Like, it's by definition not civil.
Thank you.
Well, that also depends on how you.
Oh, I thought you were gonna.
Thank you so much.